Anyway, we're so glad to have Wiley here, and we can't wait for him to discuss it. Of course, afterwards, we're going to sign. And what we'll ask you to do is just kind of form a line. And being a former school teacher, we'll have to do it. So we'll get that. Okay. But we are just pleased to have you here, so let's put our hands together and welcome.
So, okay. Thank you all so much for coming. Joanne mentioned my first book, A Land More Kind Than Home, which is probably also here for sale.
Yes.
So buy both of them. That would be great. See, she's following the rules. That book took me like 5 years to write and a couple years to find a publisher. I was dropped by an agent. I had all this rejection. I thought I'd written a failed novel, so I started thinking if I were ever going to write a second novel, if I ever thought that would be a good idea, something that I would want to try and do, what would I write about? And my wife told me a story about being a little girl and playing softball. And according to her, she was this like amazing softball player. But her only weakness was she didn't know how to slide in the base. And so in the summertime, she and her dad would go to this baseball field near her house at the elementary school where she actually went to school. And they would take turns sliding in the base and helping her learn how to do that. And I thought that was such a sweet image, because we think fathers and sons on baseball fields, we won't ever think fathers and mothers. And I imagine if you happen to be driving past that baseball field on a summer night, you saw a father and his daughter out there, kind of how heartwarming that would be. And what a great story that would be for someone like Nicholas Sparks to write about, and then make you like love these characters, and then make them all have cancer, or an avalanche, or like learn they have cancer and be on the way to the hospital, and then fall victim to an avalanche, or something like really plausible like that. But that's not really the kind of story I know how to write, and it's not really the kind of story I like to read. I like stories where people have made really bad decisions and have to somehow cope with or adapt to or suffer the consequences of those bad decisions, either decisions they've made or decisions someone in their lives have made. And so I thought, what if this little girl slides into third base, and she stands up, dusts herself off, and sees her dad in the stands, and her first thought is, why is that? Why is he coming back? So I started thinking, well, why is she mad at her dad? Well, maybe her mom's passed away, maybe they're in foster care. And this kind of started spinning. And I remember these two young girls that I knew growing up in North Carolina that were foster children. And when they were 15 and 13, I was 15 at the time, they went back to live with their birth mother. And they ended up being murdered by these two guys that they dated. The 15-year-old's boyfriend was in his 20s, he was like 22. The 13-year-old's boyfriend was like 34 or something. And these two guys accused them of stealing drugs and drove them out to this mountain in my hometown and murdered them and tried to dispose of the bodies. But that tragedy always stuck with me because I thought that these girls never had a chance. They kind of fell victim to their circumstances and decisions that were made for them. They never really had true control of their future. So when I went back and thought about that young girl standing on third base who might be in a foster home, hates her dad, I thought maybe she has a sister she cares for. Maybe they're kind of alone in this world. And that's where this idea of the novel came. And so when A Land More Kind Than Home finally sold, my agent said, before it sold, he said, do you have an idea for a second book? And I said, kind of. And he said, I think we should try to get into a book. And I said, can we get a free book? I'd rather have one of those. If they're giving those out, that would be better for me. And so I submitted a manuscript of Land More Kind and the synopsis of The Star Road, and both books were purchased. And so I was writing this book even before Land More Kind Than Home came out. That's when they came out kind of quickly upon one another. But I thought that tonight I would read just a tiny bit to give you an idea of what the book is going to be like, and then we're going to do a Q&A. We're going to do a Q&A with some good folks from the MFA program here in town. But the opening scene in this novel is the scene that I had in my mind for so long before I even started writing. It was the scene of a little girl standing on base, waiting to figure out what her dad wants. Her name is Easter Quilby. She's 12 years old. She knows her dad, whose name is Wade. She knows he's a total loser, but she really wishes. There's another narrator named Brady Weller. He's their court-appointed guardian ad litem. North Carolina has a really interesting system for children and social services. They're appointed both a volunteer from the community and an attorney who work in tandem to kind of shepherd them through the process of social services. And Brady's an ex-police officer who's now a volunteer. He has tragedy in his own past. He has a terrible relationship with his own daughter. And so when these two girls go missing, he hopes that in finding them and rescuing them, he can rescue something of himself and something of his own daughter and his relationship and how she sees him. The final narrator is a bounty hunter named Pruitt, who is out to find Wade and out to find these girls because of this intricate past that he has with Wade. But I thought I'd start tonight by reading a little bit from Easter's perspective. So she's 12 years old. Wade disappeared on us when I was 9 years old, and then he showed up out of nowhere the year I turned 12. By then I'd spent nearly 3 years listening to Mom blame him for everything from the lights getting turned off to me and Ruby not having new shoes to wear to school. And by the time he came back, I'd already decided that he was the loser she'd always said he was. But it turns out he was much more than that. He was also a thief. And if I'd known what kind of people were looking for him, I never would have let him take me and my little sister out of Gaston in North Carolina in the first place. My earliest memories of Wade are from my mom taking me to the baseball stadium at Sims Field back before she died. She'd point to the field and say, "There's your daddy, right there." I wasn't any older than 3 or 4, but I can still remember staring out at the infield of all the men with the exact same wear uniforms, wondering how I would ever spot my daddy at a baseball game if he looked just like everybody else. It's funny to think about that now, because on the day he decided to come back for us, I knew Wade as soon as I saw him sitting up in the bleachers down the first base line. I'd always called him Wade because it never felt right to think of him as dad or daddy or anything else a kid was supposed to call him. Parents who got called things like that did stuff for their kids that I could never imagine Wade doing for us. All he'd ever done for me was give me a baby sister named Ruby and enough stories for my mom to spend the rest of her life telling. But she ended up dying just before I turned 12, which was the only reason Wade came looking for me and Ruby in the first place. I just made it to third base, and I had no problem acting like I didn't see him sitting up there. My eyes raised themselves just enough to spy Ruby sitting on the bench, waiting on her turn to kick. She had her back to the bleachers and hadn't seen him yet. She might not even have recognized him if she had. To look at Ruby and Wade, you wouldn't even know they were related. But you could have said the same thing about me and her. Ruby looked just like Mom. She had long dark hair, dark eyes, and dark skin, even more. I was just the opposite. My hair was strawberry blonde and straight as a board. My skin was more likely to burn and freckle than tan. Ruby was beautiful. She always had been, but I look just like Wade. Then she makes it home plate and goes and sits on the bench, and then she hears somebody whisper her name. She looks down the baseline and it's her dad. And he says, "I'm back." And she says, "Who cares? I want nothing to do with you." And then a week later, the girls go missing. And one of the first people who's contacted is their court-appointed guardian I mentioned earlier named Brady. And I thought I would read just a few lines from them to give you an idea of what his voice sounds like. The first child I was ever assigned was a newborn baby boy named Stephen. His mom had just come home from the hospital when her boyfriend showed up at the house and shot her twice as she was trying to run out the back door. He went back inside and set the place on fire. And then he shot himself out in the front yard. Maybe he never knew his son was in a crib back in the bedroom. If he did, he sure didn't do nothing about it. Almost the entire house burned down around that one bedroom before the fire department got there to put it out. That little boy survived without a scratch on him. People on the scene said it was some kind of miracle, especially after they found out how that fire had come to be started and what all had taken place that day. Now, you tell me a child who survives something like that isn't going to do something great with his life, or mine. That little boy's now living with his adopted family over in Belmont, about 10 miles from the place where he should have died. He'll start the first grade this year. There's a little bit of happiness out there in this world. Sometimes these kids are lucky enough to find it. Some folks find their way to being a guardian ad litem because they feel moved to help kids and families that can't help themselves. Not me. That's not how I got here. I found my way here by trying to undo something that can never be undone. And that will to undo it is probably why I've lasted as long as I have. 6 years is a long time to watch families being torn apart. Parents leaving their kids behind, babies without names being born into this world already addicted to the same things that got their mamas and daddies in trouble in the first place. But it took me a while to see myself as someone who could ever speak on a child's behalf, unless it was my own daughter's. But I got used to it, and the years passed, and it became easier and easier. It seemed more and more natural. And then I was asked to speak for Easter and Ruby Quill, 2 little girls, sisters, who didn't have anybody else in this world to listen to them and give them a voice. And now they'd gone missing, and their voices were even harder to hear. So those are 2 of the voices in this novel, and the 3rd belongs to the bounty hunter Pruitt. So it was interesting. He's the villain, so it was interesting writing from the villain's perspective. But I'll let you decide what his voice sounds like, so you don't hear mine. But I guess I'm thinking it's okay if you hear mine when you're thinking about a 12-year-old girl. I don't know what that says about me or you, right? I don't know. So, you want to?
Sure, I'll let Dallas start it off.
That's what I was wondering.
Sure, that's fine with me. I'll sit here in this throne chair.
The throne chair?
Yeah.
You gotta be where we can see you though, so handsome up. Right. Look at this old lady who's a girl here. Cats. I'm so sure.
Mind the camera, it's important.
You're good.
Always want to be in the camera if you can.
All right, I have just a few questions. That's what it's at. In both of your novels, there's a large focus on youth and the loss of innocence. What is it about coming-of-age stories that you're so proud of? These novels you have very
I think coming-of-age stories are some of the best stories. You know, when I think of coming-of-age stories, especially in Southern fiction, I think of To Kill a Mockingbird, Ellen Foster, Cold Sassy Tree, stories like Barn Burning. Those are some of my favorite things that I grew up reading. What I love about coming-of-age stories is that in coming-of-age, you lose something you can never get back. When I was teaching, I was teaching at a little liberal arts college in West Virginia, and I taught a class on coming of age. It was an honors fiction class, one of the best classes I've ever taught. And every book that we read for the semester was a coming of age. And we discussed that the theme for the semester seemed to be that once you know, you can never not know. And that's what I love about these coming of age stories. Once you know evil, you can never not know. So when you have a novel with adult characters who come up against evil or loss or betrayal or some kind of horrible family secret, the devastation isn't as great and the shock isn't as pure as it is for children. Because children, at that moment, they can't go back. And the first time you cross a threshold you can't return to, that's the time it counts. That's the time it sticks with you. So that's what really interests me about it.
and kind of related to the idea of protagonists, you know, in both of your novels, there's multiple narrators, but there's plenty of other interesting characters as well. I'm wondering, kind of, how do you decide whose voice needs to be heard?
With the first book, I had the grandfather, Jimmy Hall, was a narrator for a while. I had Ben, the boy's father, was a narrator for a while. But I couldn't get Ben's voice right because I couldn't keep him from being melodramatic about his loss and his anger. And I think when you write, and y'all are MFA students, for some reason I'm thinking about workshop stuff. When you write and you create a character, that character can't always be on the 10 because that 10 becomes the bone. So if the character's always mad or always angry or always disappointed or always frustrated, then they're always nothing because the scale of emotion has to be real. And every time Ben was on the page, when we first meet Ben, not long after he discovers his son has died, his wife isn't coming home, there may be something untoward going on with her and someone else. And so he's not going to be a guy whose emotional journey in the novel is going to change for him, right? And so when he's on the stage, it's going to be super, super intense. And I couldn't sustain that kind of intensity in the voice. And then Jimmy, the grandfather, was so defensive because of his role in some of the stuff in the community that I couldn't get him to not protect himself as a narrator. I couldn't manipulate him to do what I needed him to do. And so he had to come on, he had to come out of the story. And so I finally landed on Jess and Clem and Adelaide, and I felt they brought a nice roundness to the novel. And so when I was writing This Dark Road, I just kind of lucked upon 3 narrators again. I thought maybe Easter's boyfriend Marcus might be a narrator. I thought maybe Wade might be a narrator. But once I discovered these 3 voices, they seemed to give the same roundness to the story that Voices of Land and Time did. So I kind of just rolled with that.
Speaking to the second novel here, what exactly was it? How was it writing that?
Well, yeah, Pruitt is the one, in A Land More Kind, Jess is the family, Adelaide's the church, Clem is the community. And so in This Dark Road, Easter is the family, Brady is the community, and Pruitt is the past. And without Pruitt, we don't know Wade's past. We don't know his history as a baseball player, his history as a headhunter, his history as someone who fixed games. We don't know those things, but we need to know Wade's past in order to understand who he is in the present moment. And if Wade were a narrator, he would be the kind of guy who would make his past more rose-tinted than it actually is. But Pruitt as a villain was a particularly tough challenge because when you're writing about this maniacal villain who's like willing to do anything to find this guy and his 2 little girls, you start thinking, man, this wouldn't think I'm crazy, And so I read a lot of novels. Well, there's not a whole lot of novels, but I read the ones I could find where a villain was the narrator, like American Psycho, where if y'all have read the book or seen the movie, it's the most disturbing thing you can read. If you haven't read it, buy my book tonight and then come back tomorrow and get American Psycho and read it, or watch the Christian Bale movie, which is absolutely difficult, but it's a wonderful movie. But it's this guy who's delighting in killing people and dismembering people and then wearing Armani suits and wearing plastic over his suits to not get them dirty, and he's talking about Whitney Houston's greatest love of all while he's doing all these horrible things. And by halfway through the novel, you're like, I kind of hope he doesn't get caught. What does that say about me? Because he just so firmly entrenches you in this world. There's another novel called The Sisters Brothers. Patrick DeWitt, I think, wrote that. And it's narrated by this kind of hapless loser villain. So I really studied those things and thought, how do you create a villain that the reader feels for and fears at the same time? So I wanted the reader to understand the trajectory of how he got to be who he is, but I didn't want them feeling too comfortable in his sin. And one of the things I did in terms of his narrative, his entire sections in the novel I wrote without using self-reflexive pronouns like I or, he never said I in the first draft of the book, because I wanted the reader to feel distanced from him. And then I went back in and for matters of clarification put a few I's in. But he says I as little as possible. He talks, instead of saying I took my glasses off, he would say my hand lifted to my face and I took my glasses, because I didn't want you to see that I and never think I am doing that. And I wanted him to feel cold and distant and menacing. And I think those pronouns hopefully keep him as shoulders.
Well, thank you for organically going to this question. In both your novels,
See, you never know what's going to happen when the camera's on.
keep it loose. But I was wondering what draws you to that perspective. Talk about rather than
I thought about making Pruitt third and having the other 2 first. But that was an obvious construct of a novel that I felt that showed the seams. And I don't like novels that show the seams. Unless they're purposefully experimental in a way that, like David Foster Wallace says with Infinite Jest or something like that. You know, I always kind of cringe a little when you get to the very last 10 pages of a novel and then suddenly a new narrator is introduced to tie it all together. And you're like, wow, what a ripoff. I feel totally manipulated by this. This was easy for the writer and not organic to the novel. And so, if I'm going to do first person, I like to stick with it. Now, that being said, I'm not doing that in my next book. I have one first person narrator and two third person limited perspectives. And I'm trying to find a way to make that as organic and lacking artifice as much as possible. But I like first person because it brings the heat and immediacy to the story. And Southern literature has a long history of first person narrations. And Ernest Gaines, Kay Gibbons, and Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, Faulkner's Barn Burning I mentioned before is first person. And so I think that the rhythm of the first person narration is really, really fun. And I like the challenge of trying to simulate the differences between the narration and the dialogue. Trying to get the rhythm of the language down. I was in Savannah this past weekend, a couple days ago, at a literature conference, and a woman asked a question during the Q&A. She stood up, she said, when I opened up this book, you know, I just almost wanted to throw it back up on the coffee table. I thought, this thing's so hard to read. These voices are hard. You know, why don't you make it so hard to read? And I said, I don't want to offend you, but these characters talk exactly like you do. I said, if someone went to your parents' house or your house for Sunday lunch or dinner and turned on a tape recorder and then recorded exactly on a computer screen the things that y'all said, you might have difficulty reading that. But if you just read it and hear it, you don't, you know. Because I don't change the way the words they appear. I don't drop my G's or change my its to its. I don't do any of that. I might change the way the words are used. I might, like she did, throw the book back up on the coffee table, you know, string together a bunch of prepositions, like, you know, get the damn dog out from up under the porch or something like that, back up on there, or something like that. But, you know, the language doesn't look any differently. But, you know, for example, when my wife was reading the early drafts of Land More Kind, she was reading the scene where Adelaide goes down to Asheville and then comes back up to Madison. And there's a line about her going up the mountain. Mallory said, people don't talk like that. This is gonna throw people off when they see this. And I said, read it out loud. She said, oh, yeah, they do. Your dad talks like that. It's like, yes, he does. That's where this came from, you know. And so I like doing that. I like trying to match the audible with, you know, the appearance of what it's supposed to be on the page to me, and find interesting ways to portray the dialect and the narrative voice without the shortcuts of phonetic writing, you know, gets instead of gets. You know, I want you to read get, but I want you to hear get and think it's really hard to read, but it's not. Hopefully it's not.
I didn't think so.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
All right. You mentioned kind of in the afterword section, or what have you, in A Land More Kind than Home, that you centered your stories in North Carolina, because that's when they felt real to you. You mentioned that earlier in your stories felt a little vague. But in this new novel, you expand that. Section 6 is,
Yeah.
you mentioned some of that. Find as you progress in your career, exploring new places in your writing, or do you think it'll always be centered?
It'll always be centered in North Carolina, you know. Writing about St. Louis, it was terrifying. I mean, it was terrifying. And I've never been to St. Louis. And I thought, I'm gonna get eaten alive by these Cardinals fans. I don't know St. Louis. I know Myrtle Beach really well. I know Charleston. I know, you know, Gastonia, obviously, and Mount Visco and Blue Ridge Parkway. But I was terrified of writing about St. Louis. So I did a lot of research into the old Bush Stadium, not the new Bush Stadium, it was the old Bush Stadium where the home run race happened. I got on Google Earth and literally like walked the streets of St. Louis and looked at older photos, circa 1998, of where things were in landmarks, where were parking decks. Because everything in this novel, it's set against this real home run race, and so on that date, those were the numbers, and that was the weather, and so I wanted it to feel and as realistic as possible, but it was terrifying. I was terrified, and I was telling one of my buddies that I went to grad school with. I've been talking to him about it a lot, and I said, I'm so terrified of getting St. Louis right. I've never been to that old stadium. It's just terrifying. But he's right. Yeah, man, that's tough. A month later, I'm talking to him again. Oh, gosh, it's so weird writing outside of North Carolina. Just a couple months later, I hope I got this right. Mallory found some video of the home run that McGuire hit that day because it tied the record. That's the one I was interested in. It tied the record. There was very few videos of him tying the record. All the videos of him breaking the record. And I said, I'm glad I found that. My buddy goes, yeah, it was crazy. It was so loud. I was like, you watched it on TV? He's like, no, I was there. I was like, oh, why didn't you tell me this like 6 months ago about being there that day? And so a lot of the stuff that's in there I got from him. The way the sky looked from the ring of the stadium, the insuck of the release of size when McGuire took the strikes. I got that stuff.
So when you finally opened up.
Yeah, and that's what mining his experience.
With this new novel, you have this kind of very real thing that requires us a kind of timeline. Did you find that helps the writing of the story, or did you feel any pressure?
It was both a help and a hindrance in many ways, because I was kind of relegated to this tight schedule, and I wanted the book to move quickly. And I think if it hadn't been against this ticking clock of the home run race, it wouldn't move as quickly as it did. And so it held me accountable to the actual timeline. But it was hard to figure out how to move things around and have them happen at the time I needed them to happen. But that was also fun too, So it was a challenge, but it was also fun to look at like what was going on those days in the news or in sports, and what were the scores, and what would have been on TV, and what would have been on the radio. And stuff. It's kind of fun.
Well, that's all the questions I have.
I just have a couple.
Switch.
No, I'll switch. I want to take your picture too. Take your picture better.
I only have a couple of questions.
Okay.
It kind of goes back to you talking to your buddy and finally you found out he was there, and that's where you were able to get your information from. In the reading you did, one of the characters, the guardian ad litem, how did you go about researching what that is? Like, do you use internet sources? Do you actually try to interview somebody with that job?
My wife's an attorney.
Oh, perfect.
My wife's an attorney, and originally Brady Weller was like a private investigator who was hired by the girl's grandparents in Alaska. He was down on his luck police detective. He was all of these things, and it didn't bring the closeness and sense of emotional responsibility that I needed him to have for these two girls. I didn't want it to be a job for him, as hired to do or as compelled. I wanted it to be this emotional quest he's on. And so I started kicking around ideas, and she was practicing in West Virginia when I wrote it. She was taking the North Carolina bar as I was finishing it. And so that's where that idea came from.
And then you talked about how your first novel, seemed to be a lot of rejection at first, and an agent dropped you. What about even before that? Like, did you write stories and send them out to lit journals?
Absolutely.
Can you tell us something about that process?
Yeah, sure. That's how I started writing, really. The first story I ever wrote for publication, I wrote my sophomore year of college at Asheville, and I sent it off to a contest, and it didn't win the contest, but it got published in the contest anthology. And I thought, wow, that was easy.
Right.
I was 20. I thought, man, this is done. And I didn't have another story published for 10 years. And it wasn't that I had stopped writing or had stopped submitting stories. I was still writing stories relentlessly and sending them off relentlessly. And writing is about failing. And every day you write is another day that you fail to capture the thing that you want to capture the feel, the thing that you're trying to get at. And some days you fail better, and some days you fail worse than others. But my rejection log is like 8-point font, and it's like 21 single-page pages of rejections from magazines. You know, I had long rejection affairs with magazines, like Southern Review in Louisiana. I was living in Louisiana, and Brett Lott, who was the editor at the time, I would send him a story on Monday. He would get it on Tuesday, send me a rejection on Wednesday. I would get it on Thursday. I would mail him a story on Friday, get to him on Monday. He'd send me a rejection Tuesday. We probably did that 10 times.
Wow.
And many of and they were always nice. They were always handwritten notes, and that's really what you hope for, is a handwritten rejection. That's really what you kind of cling to. You get that self-addressed stamped on mail. And he was rejecting part of Landmark High. He was rejecting excerpts from that. And I saw him at in an AWP right after the book sold to my publisher. And I went up to his table and said, "Hey, you probably don't remember me. My name's Wiley. You rejected a ton of my stories." And he was kind of like, "Oh my gosh, are you going to freak out when you attack me?" And I said, "No." I said, "You sent me like really encouraging notes, and that made such a huge difference to me. That you sent notes, that you're so kind, you're so fast. I understand the difficult position you must be in this business. But I have a book coming out. Some of the stuff you probably don't need to read it. Some of the stuff you've already read." And he's like, "That's fantastic. Congratulations. You know what? I'm at a new journal now. I'm a Crazy Horse. Send me something right when you get back." So I was like, "Oh, cool. Crazy Horse is a great journal out of Charleston." So I get home and I send him something, and like the next day he emails back and he said, "I hate to say no." But it shows you that it doesn't matter, what your book is or where it's been or whatever's going on. My first novel was in the New York Times and won some awards, but I haven't had a story accepted since it came out. And I still get rejections. I just get them from the editor instead of the graduate assistant, and I get them faster. That's really the only difference, And I think that's how it should be. I think that editors, whether it's the Bench here in Memphis or the Southern Review down in Baton Rouge, they want the best stuff. They don't want the person who's got a book or the person who's got 2 books. They want the best thing that's on their desk at that moment. And so when I have students come to me and say, I've had a story rejected a bunch of times, it's like, get in line. We can talk about this. I'll show you my rejection letter where the stamp is still damp from them licking it. It happens, and that's the nature of the business. And so you can never love your words. You can never love your story. You can love the writing. You can love the process, but you can never love the words on the page. Take their rejection to heart. Let that impede what you want to do. It's just going to happen, and it's going to continue to happen no matter who you are.
Well, if you want to submit any fiction or anything to the Bench, we'll give it
Okay,
a thorough
thank you.
reading.
Thank you. You say that now. It's kind of awkward because we met. I solicited you. And still gonna have to say that.
That's pretty much all the questions I have. On a personal note, I haven't read your new book yet, but you sold me on it. My father taught me my sister in softball.
Oh,
So
really?
just that being the basis, even though it deviates from there, it pulled at my heart.
Okay.
I've got to read it now.
Well, do y'all have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I read about the author at the end, and it said you spent some time at the McDowell Colony. And my story supported that colony in college, and I
Okay.
always talked about it. I sort of prepared lands far away.
Y'all supported one of the studios, right?
Yes, I think
Yeah,
so.
I walked right past that one on the way to mine.
So I just wanted to know what your experience was there, how it maybe possibly contributed.
It was magical. McDowell is a writing colony. Well, not writing, but like an artist colony. So sculptors, artists, painters, visual artists, dance, filmmakers, writers. Go and you have a room in a little boarding house. It's just a room, and you share a bathroom with a couple other people. You eat all of your meals family style. Most of the food comes from the garden. It's so idyllic, it's ridiculous. And then in the morning, you walk through the woods. All the artists in residence, there's like 34 cottages that are studios that are about the size of this little area that's enclosed in bookcases. And you have like a desk, a little cot, a little bathroom in your studio. every day for lunch they bring you a lunch basket with like a sandwich and a soup and a little fruit. It's ridiculous. I mean, and I was there for 3 weeks, and what it allows you to do is, like, I work from home, you know, I have an office at home, but I'll sit down to work and think like, if I don't take the dry cleaning in right now, I won't get it back to work until Sunday, and I'm meeting Saturday. I gotta get gas, and I gotta take these books back to the library, and the cat's fingernails are trimmed. My wife works till like 5:30, so I have to do it. You know, while I'm out, I might as well, and it's noon, and I haven't done anything, you know. And people say, wow, it must be great to work from home. And it's like, no, it's not. I wish I had an office where people, you know, wouldn't call me on my cell phone and be like, hey, what's up? By people, you know, I mean my mom. I called to see how you're doing. I'm working. I thought you would be. Right. So going to a place like McDowell lets you kind of live in the work. It's pretty awesome. It's pretty cool.
Well, I read both of your books. I did this one last night. At the end of each story, the grandfather or the father kind of have a chance to redeem themselves. There's some redemption there. So I was kind of wondering if there was some male figure in your life or your family's life that you needed some kind of redemption, like a good or bad, something like that.
No, not really. I'm fortunate, you know, I have great parents. My wife has great parents. So, and maybe that's why I write. Maybe I wouldn't if that weren't the case, you know. But I think redemption is interesting, and I think it's necessary. You know, in America, we pretend like we don't like to forgive people, but we love it. Oh my gosh, we love forgiving athletes and politicians. Charlie Sheen. But when it comes to our family, that's where we draw the line for some reason. You know, we're not as quick to forgive our parents or our siblings or our spouses or whatever the case may be. So I like when characters have the chance to be redeemed and where other characters have the chance to offer them. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'd love to sign books and hang out for a little bit. You got any questions?